There are moments in life when everything keeps moving around you, but inside your chest, something suddenly stops. William didn't expect that moment to happen in an airport. Yet there he was, standing inside the crowded luxury check-in terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, holding 3 designer travel bags that did not belong to him. The terminal buzzed with movement. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. Screens flashed flight departures. Voices layered over one another as travelers hurried toward gates with the urgency that defined New York life. But William barely noticed any of it, because the woman walking ahead of him had just turned her phone camera toward herself again. His girlfriend, an influencer with millions of followers. She held the phone at the perfect angle while speaking to the camera with a cheerful voice that sounded polished from years of practice. "Good morning, everyone," she said, smiling as she walked. "Another travel day. Leaving New York again. This time, we're heading to a private resort. I can't wait to show you guys the view when we land." Thousands of people were watching her live broadcast. William shifted the weight of one bag higher on his shoulder and followed behind her. 5 years ago, nobody who knew him would have recognized this scene. Back then, William didn't follow anyone. People followed him. He was the founder of a logistics company that moved cargo across the country and overseas. His company connected trucks, warehouses, and airline shipments in ways that made investors pay attention. Competitors respected him. Partners trusted him. At business events, William was the person standing at the center of conversations. Now he stood quietly behind a woman who barely noticed the bags he was carrying. The influencer stopped walking suddenly. "Hold on," she said to the camera before lowering the phone. She turned halfway toward William. "Did you bring my passport?" William immediately reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Yes." He handed it to her. She glanced at it quickly, slipped it into her purse, and turned back to the phone. "Travel rule number 1, she said cheerfully to her audience. "Never forget your passport." The camera stayed focused on her smile. William stood just outside the frame. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just expectation. He had grown used to it. Still, something about this moment felt strange, not insulting, just empty. Because once upon a time, William had shared his life with someone who never treated him like an assistant. Her name was Imani. And oddly enough, the airport where he now stood holding someone else's luggage was the last place he had ever seen her. 5 years earlier, the influencer began walking again toward the priority boarding line. William followed automatically. The strap of one bag pressed against his shoulder, and as he adjusted it, his eyes drifted toward the massive windows lining the terminal wall. At first, he wasn't really paying attention, just watching the movement outside. Planes moved across the runway. Airport vehicles drove past with flashing lights. Then something caught his eye. A private jet rolling slowly across the runway toward the very important person arrival section. Private jets weren't unusual at JFK, but something about the way airport staff gathered nearby made William pause. Ground crew moved quickly. A staircase vehicle rolled toward the aircraft. William watched without knowing why. Behind him, the influencer's voice continued floating through the terminal as she spoke to her followers again. "You guys are going to love this resort," she said. "The villas sit right on the water." But William wasn't listening anymore. The jet outside had come to a stop. The staircase reached the aircraft door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. A woman. At first, William only saw the outline. Tall, still, poised in the sunlight. She stepped forward slowly. Her dark hair moved slightly in the breeze as she began walking down the staircase. Something about the way she carried herself felt familiar. William frowned slightly. Then 2 small figures appeared behind her. Children. Twins. They held her hands as they carefully stepped down the stairs together. William's breath caught in his chest, because the moment the woman reached the runway and lifted her head toward the terminal windows, he recognized her. Imani. The name moved through his mind before he even fully believed what he was seeing. 5 years had passed since the last time he saw her, yet he would have recognized her anywhere. She looked different now, not older, stronger. There was a calm confidence in the way she stood that hadn't existed years ago. She wore a long coat that moved slightly in the wind, simple, elegant, the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to impress anyone. The twins held her hands tightly as they walked beside her. One of them pointed excitedly at a plane lifting into the sky. The other laughed when the sound of the engines echoed across the runway. Imani smiled down at them warmly. William felt something twist deep inside his chest. Inside the terminal, people continued walking. Announcements echoed through the speakers, but William stood completely still. Behind him, the influencer finally noticed he had stopped moving. "William." He didn't respond. "William," she repeated, turning around now. "Why did you stop?" But he couldn't answer. Because outside that window, the woman he once believed had disappeared from his life forever had just stepped off a private jet with 2 children who looked about 5 years old. 5 years. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The last time William saw Imani, she had walked away from him with a single suitcase. No fortune, no corporate backing, no influence. At least that's what he believed. But the woman walking across the runway now looked like someone who had built a life far larger than the one he thought she lost. Imani paused for a moment near the aircraft. One of the twins tugged her hand and pointed toward the glass walls of the terminal. She followed the child's gaze, and for one brief second, her eyes met William's. The distance between them was enormous, yet somehow the recognition was instant. William felt frozen, because something about the calm look in her eyes made him realize something unsettling. The woman he once believed needed him looked like someone who had learned how to live perfectly well without him. And William had no idea that the life she built during those 5 years was about to collide directly with his own. But before we go deeper into this story, welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're glad to have you. Subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And tell me in the comments the time and where you're watching this story from, because stories like this remind us of something important. Sometimes the people we underestimate turn out to be the ones who change the entire game. And if you've ever watched someone rise in ways nobody expected, go ahead and like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Because William was about to learn something about the past he thought he left behind, something he never saw coming. For a long moment inside the airport terminal, William couldn't move. Through the glass wall, he watched Imani walking across the runway with Jordan and Maya holding her hands. Airport staff guided them toward the very important person entrance, while ground crews continued their work nearby, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But inside William's mind, time had moved backward, because the woman he was looking at now was not the version of Imani he first met. The Imani he met years ago didn't step off private jets. She stood behind a cafe counter in Brooklyn, with flour on her hands and music playing softly through old speakers. And strangely enough, that was exactly the moment William first realized he wanted to know her. It had been a cool autumn afternoon. Back then, William was still building his logistics company. The business existed, but it was fragile. Contracts were small. Investors were cautious. Every week felt like a test of whether his ideas would actually survive in a competitive industry. He had been on his way to meet a potential shipping partner that day when he stopped in Brooklyn for coffee. The cafe sat on a quiet corner where neighbors greeted each other by name. The windows were slightly fogged from the warmth inside, and the smell of fresh pastries drifted onto the sidewalk every time the door opened. When William stepped inside, the place felt alive. A couple sat near the window laughing over something on a phone screen. 2 college students argued gently about a class project. Someone at the back tapped their foot to the rhythm of an old soul song playing through the speakers. It was the kind of place where people stayed longer than they planned. William walked toward the counter, scanning the menu above the register. That was when he noticed her. Imani stood behind the counter, talking to an elderly man who clearly enjoyed telling long stories. The man had been speaking for several minutes already. His hands moved animatedly while he described something William couldn't hear. Most people in a busy cafe would have politely interrupted him. Imani didn't. She listened patiently. And when the man finished his story, she laughed with genuine warmth, as if it had been the best story she'd heard all day. William noticed that immediately, not because the moment was dramatic, but because it felt sincere. When the man finally stepped away from the counter, Imani turned toward William with a friendly smile. "What can I get you?" she asked. William glanced up at the menu. The choices weren't complicated, but for some reason, He studied it longer than necessary. Coffee, he finally said. Imani nodded approvingly. Good choice. She turned toward the machine behind her. It's the one thing we do better than everyone else. William smiled slightly. There was confidence in her voice, but it didn't feel arrogant, just playful. A few minutes later, she returned with the cup and placed it gently on the counter. First time here? She asked. William nodded. Passing through Brooklyn for a meeting. She tilted her head slightly. What kind of work do you do? Logistics, he replied. Imani's eyes brightened a little. Cargo systems? William blinked in surprise. Yes. She leaned casually against the counter. Air routes, warehouse transfers, regional shipping networks. That kind of logistics? William stared at her for a moment. Most people hear the word logistics and immediately change the subject, he said. Imani laughed softly. That's because most people don't realize how important it is. She gestured lightly toward the window, where delivery trucks occasionally passed by. The whole world depends on invisible systems moving things around. William leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? She stirred a spoon through a cup beside her while thinking for a moment. Food, medicine, clothes, electronics, she said calmly. Everything people rely on has to travel from one place to another. She looked back at him. If those systems stopped working for just a few days, cities would panic. William studied her with growing curiosity. Sounds like you've thought about this a lot. Imani smiled. Maybe. Her answer was casual, but something about the quiet confidence behind it made William feel unexpectedly impressed. Their conversation continued for several minutes. William eventually realized he had been sitting at the counter much longer than he planned. When he checked his watch, he laughed quietly. I'm going to be late for my meeting. Imani shrugged playfully. Then the coffee must be working. William returned to the cafe the next day. At least, that's what he told himself. Because the coffee was good, but the truth was simpler. He returned because of Imani. Their conversations grew longer each time he visited. At first, they talked about ordinary things, music, neighborhood events, life in New York. But gradually their conversations drifted deeper into the world of shipping networks and transportation systems. William discovered something that fascinated him. Imani understood logistics in a way very few people did. Not just the surface-level details. She understood the hidden connections. How cargo flights linked with trucking routes. How warehouse timing affected delivery speed across entire regions. How small changes in coordination could save companies millions of dollars. One evening, long after most customers had left, William sat at a small table near the counter while Imani wiped down nearby surfaces. You know something funny? She said thoughtfully. What? Most people think airplanes, trucks, and cargo ships are separate industries. William nodded. That's how most companies treat them. Imani shook her head gently. They're not separate. She tapped the table lightly. They're pieces of the same system. William leaned back in his chair, listening carefully. If someone ever connected those systems properly, she continued, goods could move across the country twice as efficiently. There was no arrogance in her voice, just calm belief. William stared at her with quiet admiration. You sound like someone who plans to run the entire system one day. Imani laughed softly. Maybe someday. At the time, William thought it was just an ambitious dream. But sitting inside JFK Airport years later, watching the woman who once served him coffee walk confidently across a runway beside a private jet, William realized something unsettling. Imani had never been dreaming. She had been preparing, and somehow during the years he was chasing success. She had quietly built something far greater than he ever imagined. Standing inside the airport terminal years later, William watched Imani walk across the runway with Jordan and Maya beside her. The sight of her pulled another memory from a place in his mind he hadn't visited in a long time, a summer night in Harlem. Back then, life had felt simpler. William had only known Imani for a few weeks when she suggested they spend an evening walking through Harlem instead of going to one of the expensive restaurants he normally chose. Trust me, she told him over the phone. You'll enjoy this more. William had laughed. You're very confident about that. Because I know something you don't, she replied playfully. What's that? Good music and good food beat fancy restaurants every time. That night, the city felt alive in a way William rarely experienced in his usual social circle. Music floated through open restaurant doors. People stood outside talking, laughing, greeting neighbors. The smell of grilled food drifted down the sidewalks, while street performers played saxophones under glowing streetlights. William looked around with quiet curiosity as they walked. "This place feels different," he admitted. Imani smiled. "That's because people here don't spend their whole night trying to impress each other." A band inside a small restaurant began playing a lively rhythm. Several people near the entrance started dancing casually on the sidewalk. William chuckled. "I should warn you," he said. "I don't dance." Imani stopped walking and looked at him. "You're serious?" "Completely." She grabbed his hand before he could say anything else. "Well, tonight you're learning." William hesitated as she pulled him toward the music. "Imani." "Relax," she said with a laugh. "Nobody here cares about perfect steps." The music was loud enough that conversation became impossible. People clapped to the rhythm, while couples moved easily across the sidewalk. William felt completely out of place, but Imani simply placed one hand lightly on his shoulder and began moving to the beat. "Just follow me," she said. At first, William stepped awkwardly. He missed the rhythm more than once. But instead of teasing him, Imani laughed and guided him gently. "See?" she said after a minute. "You're doing it." William shook his head, smiling despite himself. "This is not dancing." "It is," she insisted. "You're just overthinking it." Something about the moment made William relax. For once, he wasn't thinking about contracts or investors. He wasn't trying to control the room. He was simply standing on a Harlem sidewalk with music in the air and a woman laughing beside him. Later that evening, they walked slowly through the neighborhood. The energy of the street faded into quieter blocks where apartment windows glowed warmly above them. "You look surprised," Imani said after a while. "I am." "Why?" William thought for a moment before answering. "Because I spend most of my time in rooms where everyone is trying to appear successful." Imani raised an eyebrow. "And here? People just seem comfortable." She nodded. "That's because nobody here thinks happiness depends on impressing strangers." William glanced at her thoughtfully. "You really believe that?" Imani shrugged lightly. "I grew up around people who didn't have much money." She gestured toward the neighborhood around them, but they still laughed a lot. Her voice carried a quiet truth that William felt immediately. "My world is different," he admitted. "Private schools," she said casually. William blinked. "How did you guess?" "You talk like someone who spent a lot of time around boardrooms." William laughed. "Fair point." They stopped near a small park where the distant sound of music still drifted through the air. William leaned against the railing while looking out across the city lights. "You know something interesting?" he said. "What?" "I spend my life studying transportation systems." Imani smiled. "The invisible systems." "Exactly." William looked at her carefully. "But lately, I've started realizing something." "What's that?" "The most important things in life aren't systems." She tilted her head slightly. "Then what are they?" William hesitated for a moment before answering. "People." Imani watched him quietly. William rarely spoke this openly with anyone, yet somehow talking to her felt natural. "What do you want your life to look like?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "I mean long term," she clarified. "Not just business." William thought about it. "I want to build something that matters," he said. "A company that connects the world more efficiently." "That's the professional answer," she said gently. "And the personal one?" William looked at her. For a moment, the city noise faded into the background. "I want someone beside me while I build it." Imani smiled softly. "Partnership." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Marriage should feel like that." William raised an eyebrow. "You're already thinking about marriage?" Imani laughed. "No." She stepped closer, leaning lightly against the railing beside him. "I'm just saying that if I ever get married, it has to be equal." William studied her expression. "What do you mean?" "No one carrying the other," she said calmly. "No one shrinking themselves so the other person can shine." She looked directly at him. Two people building something together. Her words stayed with William long after that night. Months later, they stood together on the balcony of his apartment overlooking the New York skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath them. William held a small velvet box in his hand. Imani looked at it with surprise. "William." He opened the box slowly. Inside was a ring that reflected the city lights around them. "I know life is complicated," he said quietly. And I know I'm still building my future. He looked at her. But I want to build it with you. Imani stared at the ring for a long moment. Then she met his eyes. Marriage isn't just love, she said softly. It's partnership. William nodded. That's exactly what I want. A slow smile appeared on her face. And that night, standing above the glowing city they both loved, Imani said yes. For a while after that, life felt exactly the way they imagined it would. Two people building something meaningful together. But standing in the airport years later, watching Imani walk confidently beside the twins, William felt a quiet realization forming in his chest. Because somewhere along the path to success, he had forgotten the promise that brought them together in the first place, and that forgotten promise had changed both of their lives forever. In the years following William and Imani's wedding, life in New York seemed to move faster with every passing season. The city had a way of rewarding ambition, and William possessed plenty of it. When they first married, his logistics company was still fragile. The systems he designed showed promise, but contracts were small and every deal carried the pressure of survival. William worked relentlessly. Early mornings often started before sunrise with spreadsheets spread across the kitchen table. He studied shipping schedules, truck routes, warehouse capacity, and airline cargo timing while sipping coffee that had gone cold long before he finished it. Imani sometimes sat across from him during those mornings. She would read quietly while he worked, occasionally glancing up when he asked her opinion about a route change or a delivery delay. What if the cargo from Chicago arrives 6 hours earlier? He asked once, tapping his pen against the table. Imani leaned forward, studying the notes. Then the trucks leaving Newark will sit idle, she said calmly. William frowned. You're right, she smiled. You're thinking about the aircraft schedule. And you're thinking about the warehouses, he replied. Exactly. Moments like that reminded William why he believed their partnership would make his company stronger, but business success rarely waits patiently. Within 2 years, things began to change. A major contract arrived first. A national retail chain needed faster cargo delivery between several cities. Their existing systems were inefficient, and delays were costing them money. William proposed a new structure connecting cargo flights with regional trucking routes. The plan was bold. If it worked, it would reduce delivery times dramatically. The company accepted his proposal. For several weeks, William barely slept. He coordinated schedules with airports, negotiated with warehouse managers, and studied every possible weakness in the system. When the network finally launched, the results were immediate. Packages began arriving hours earlier than expected. Costs dropped. The retail company extended their contract for multiple years. Word traveled quickly in the logistics industry. Soon, other companies began calling. William's office phone rang constantly. Investors wanted meetings. Partners wanted introductions. Journalists requested interviews about the new transportation strategy. One afternoon, Imani walked into William's office, carrying lunch for both of them. She paused when she saw the room. Whiteboards covered nearly every wall, filled with route diagrams and shipping schedules. William stood near the largest board speaking on the phone. Yes, he said confidently. We can handle West Coast distribution as well. He listened for a moment. Send the numbers, and I'll review them tonight. When he hung up, he finally noticed Imani standing in the doorway. You've been here since morning, she said gently. William smiled tiredly. I didn't even realize it was afternoon. She placed the food on his desk. You should eat. William sat down and opened the container. I can't believe how fast everything is moving, he admitted. Imani pulled a chair beside him. That's what happens when good ideas meet opportunity. William nodded. For a moment, they ate quietly. Then he leaned back in his chair. I have to fly to Chicago tomorrow, he said. Another meeting? Yes. She didn't complain. At that point, the travel still felt exciting. It meant progress. It meant William's ideas were finally gaining recognition. Over the next year, his schedule filled with flights across the country. Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles. Sometimes he returned home after midnight. Other times he left before sunrise. Each trip brought new opportunities. At industry conferences, people began recognizing his name. Executives approached him after presentations to ask about his network systems. Investors invited him to private meetings. Imani attended some of those events with him in the early months. She stood beside William, while he explained cargo structures to potential partners. Many people were surprised when they realized she understood the technical details just as well. During one reception, a businessman laughed after hearing her explanation of route coordination. "You sound like you designed the system yourself," he said. Imani smiled politely. "I just enjoy understanding how things work." William placed a proud hand on her shoulder. "She keeps me honest," he said. For a while, those events felt like shared victories. But success has a subtle effect on people. The more William's reputation grew, the more attention he received. Rooms began to shift when he entered. People listened carefully when he spoke. Compliments became common. "You're changing the way logistics works. Your system is the future. Your company will dominate this industry." At first, William laughed off the praise. But admiration has a quiet way of settling into a person's thinking. Eventually, he began expecting it. One evening after returning from a conference in Los Angeles, William stood on the balcony of their apartment, overlooking the glowing skyline. Imani joined him with 2 glasses of wine. "You look thoughtful," she said. William leaned against the railing. "Something strange happened today." "What?" "A group of executives asked me for advice about restructuring their delivery networks." She handed him a glass. "That sounds like a compliment." "It is," he admitted. "But it also made me realize something." Imani waited. William looked out across the city lights. "I'm becoming one of the most influential people in this industry." The statement wasn't arrogant, just factual. Imani nodded. "You've worked hard for it." William smiled. "And I'm not even close to finished." She studied him quietly. Ambition had always been part of William's personality, but now it carried a sharper edge. His company continued expanding. New contracts arrived almost weekly. Investors poured money into the business, allowing him to hire more staff and open additional offices. With every success, William's confidence grew, but so did something else. He began spending less time discussing ideas with Imani, less time asking for her perspective, not because he stopped respecting her intelligence, but because the world outside their apartment was constantly telling him he already had the answers. And slowly, without either of them fully noticing at first, the balance in their partnership began to change. The man who once believed success meant building something with Imani was starting to believe success meant building something around himself. Success rarely damages a relationship in one dramatic moment. More often, it happens quietly. A small change in routine, a missed conversation, a promise delayed until tomorrow. For William and Imani, the distance began in moments so small they almost seemed unimportant at first. One evening marked their 3rd wedding anniversary. Imani spent most of the afternoon preparing dinner at home. Nothing extravagant, just the kind of meal they used to enjoy when life felt less complicated. Soft music played in the background while she moved between the kitchen and the dining table. She set 2 plates carefully, adjusting the napkins until everything looked just right. Outside the apartment windows, the sun slowly faded behind the buildings of Manhattan. 7 o'clock came. William had promised he would be home before dinner. Imani checked her phone once. No message. She poured a glass of wine and waited a little longer. 8 o'clock arrived. The food was still warm. She sat down at the table, hoping the elevator would open any moment. 9 o'clock. Her phone finally rang. William's name appeared on the screen. She answered immediately. "Hey," he said. His voice carried the familiar background noise of a busy restaurant. "Happy anniversary," she said gently. "I know," William replied quickly. "I'm really sorry." Imani leaned back in her chair. "The meeting ran long?" "Much longer than expected," he admitted. "These investors flew in from California. I couldn't leave early." She stared quietly at the empty chair across the table. "It's okay," she said. But the truth was more complicated than that. When the call ended, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Imani eventually cleared the table and placed the untouched food in the refrigerator. Moments like that began appearing more often. William's schedule continued filling with meetings, conferences, and travel across the country. He tried to balance everything, but success demanded attention at every hour. When he returned home, his mind often remained somewhere else. One night, Imani sat on the couch reading, while William worked on his laptop nearby. The glow of the screen reflected in his glasses as he studied financial reports. "You've been staring at those numbers for 2 hours," she said. "I'm almost finished," he replied, without looking up. Almost finished turned into another hour. Eventually, Imani closed her book. Do you ever miss when we used to talk about things that weren't business? William finally looked up. What do you mean? Before your company became your entire schedule. He leaned back in the chair. This is temporary. Imani smiled slightly. That's what you said 6 months ago. William rubbed his eyes. I'm building something big, Imani. I know, she said softly, and I'm proud of you. The sincerity in her voice was real. She had always supported his ambition, but support didn't remove loneliness. Over the next several months, another small detail began catching Imani's attention. Photos. At first, she noticed them by accident while scrolling through articles about logistics conferences. Several media outlets had started covering William's presentations. In the pictures, William stood on stages explaining his transportation systems to large audiences. Sometimes he appeared in group photos with other business leaders, but gradually one face began appearing repeatedly beside him, the influencer. Her online presence had grown rapidly in the business and luxury lifestyle world. She attended high-profile events and documented them for millions of followers. In several photos, she stood beside William, smiling confidently while cameras flashed. The captions usually described the moment as networking, industry coverage, publicity. None of the photos suggested anything inappropriate. Still, the pattern was noticeable. One evening while they ate dinner together, Imani mentioned it casually. I saw some pictures from your conference in Chicago. William nodded. That event was huge. Hundreds of people showed up. And the woman who keeps appearing in those photos? William shrugged. She's an influencer who covers business events. Imani studied him calmly. She seems to cover a lot of yours. He laughed lightly. You're reading too much into it. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was. Imani let the conversation move on, but something in her instincts told her to pay attention. Meanwhile, William's travel schedule grew even more demanding. Weeks passed where he spent more time in airports than at home. One evening he returned late after several days away. Imani greeted him at the door with a quiet smile. You look exhausted, she said. It's been a long week. She took his jacket and hung it by the door. Dinner's still warm if you're hungry. William sat down at the table while she reheated the food. They began eating quietly. For a few minutes, the atmosphere felt comfortable again. Then William's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. Imani noticed his expression change slightly. He turned the phone face down. Work? She asked. Just a message from the conference group, he replied. Imani nodded slowly. She didn't ask another question. But inside her mind, the pieces were beginning to form a pattern. Not proof, just a quiet feeling that something in their relationship had started shifting in a way neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. Later that night, William fell asleep quickly. Imani remained awake beside him for a long time. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about the early days of their marriage, the balcony conversations, the promise of partnership, the belief that they would build their future together. Now it felt as if William was building something enormous, but the space beside him was slowly becoming empty, and deep down, Imani sensed something else. William hadn't yet realized the distance growing between them, but she had, and the longer it continued, the harder it would be to repair. By the 3rd year of their marriage, William and Imani had learned how to live around the silence that sometimes filled their apartment. Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes from comfort. The other kind, the one created when two people begin feeling different things, but haven't found the right moment to say them out loud. One evening in early spring, rain fell steadily across New York City. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement below their apartment windows, and the distant sound of traffic drifted faintly through the glass. Imani sat alone in the living room waiting. William had been traveling again, this time to Dallas for a series of investor meetings. He texted earlier that afternoon saying his flight had landed and he would be home soon. Now, it was almost 10 o'clock. The rain continued falling outside while the apartment remained quiet. Imani rested both hands around a warm mug of tea, staring at the city lights. When the door finally opened, she looked up. William stepped inside carrying his briefcase and a tired expression. Hey, he said. Hey. He removed his coat and loosened his tie. Long day, he added. Imani stood up slowly. I figured. William walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water before joining her in the living room. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Then Imani broke the silence. "William, we need to talk." He leaned back against the couch. "Can it wait until morning?" Her voice stayed calm. "No." Something in the way she said it made him sit upright. "What's wrong?" Imani took a slow breath before answering. "I feel like I'm disappearing from your life." William frowned immediately. "That's not true." "Then why does it feel like you're everywhere except here?" The question hung quietly between them. William rubbed his forehead. "You know how much pressure the company is under right now." "I do," she replied, "and I've supported that from the beginning. I'm building something huge for us." Imani shook her head gently. "I never asked you to build the world for me." William looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I just asked you not to forget that I'm part of it." Her tone wasn't angry. That made the moment even heavier. William stared down at his hands for several seconds. The truth was complicated. He wasn't trying to hurt her, but the pace of his success had pulled him into a constant cycle of meetings, flights, and negotiations. The admiration from investors and partners felt energizing, addictive even. Meanwhile, the quiet routines of home life began feeling distant. Finally, he said, "Things will slow down eventually." Imani studied his face. "Will they?" William didn't answer. Another silence settled between them. Then Imani spoke again. "There's something else." William looked up. "What?" For the first time that evening, her expression softened. "I went to the doctor this week." He waited. Imani's hand rested lightly on her stomach. "I'm pregnant." The words filled the room with sudden stillness. William blinked in surprise. "You're serious?" She nodded. "Yes." For a moment, he looked stunned. Then he stood and walked toward her. He wrapped his arms around her carefully. "That's amazing." Imani closed her eyes briefly, but as he pulled back, she noticed something missing from his reaction. Excitement. The kind of joy that fills a room with energy. Instead, William looked thoughtful, almost overwhelmed. "How far along?" he asked. "About 8 weeks." William nodded slowly. "That's a lot to process." "There's more," she added gently. "What do you mean?" "The doctor says it's twins." William stared at her again. "Twins?" She smiled faintly. "Yes." For a moment, he didn't speak. His mind was already racing through practical concerns. Schedules, business travel, responsibilities. The company was expanding faster than he expected. Now the idea of raising 2 children at the same time entered the picture. Imani watched his reaction carefully. "You don't look excited," she said quietly. William quickly shook his head. "No, that's not it." He tried to smile. "It's just a lot at once." She nodded slowly. "I understand." But deep inside, something shifted. She had imagined this moment differently. Later that evening, William fell asleep quickly. Travel always exhausted him. Imani stayed awake. She sat at the kitchen table in the dim light, thinking about the conversation they just had. Eventually, she stood and walked to the hallway where William's coat hung. She reached for it, not because she was searching for anything, just out of habit. As she lifted the coat to hang it properly, a faint scent reached her. Perfume. Not the kind she wore. Imani froze for a moment. Her mind moved through possibilities. Maybe someone brushed past him during a crowded event. Maybe a colleague hugged him goodbye. Maybe it meant nothing. She returned the coat to its place. No accusations formed in her mind. No dramatic conclusions. Just a quiet understanding settling slowly into her thoughts. William had changed, not into someone cruel, not into someone heartless, but into someone whose life had expanded in directions where she no longer felt included. She walked back to the kitchen table and sat down again. Her hand rested gently on her stomach. Inside her body, 2 small lives were growing, 2 futures depending on her strength. And in that quiet moment, Imani understood something with perfect clarity. She could continue hoping William would return to the man who once promised partnership, or she could begin preparing for a life where she protected her dignity and her children's future. The realization hurt, but it also brought a strange calm, because sometimes the hardest truth to accept is also the one that sets a person free. Imani looked toward the bedroom, where William slept peacefully. The man she loved was still there, but the partnership they once promised each other had slowly faded, and for the first time since they married, she realized something painful. She was no longer standing beside him in his life. She was standing somewhere behind him, an afterthought in a future he was building, without noticing her fading presence, and that quiet understanding would soon lead to the decision that changed everything. The apartment was quiet long after midnight. Outside the windows, the rain that had fallen earlier had finally stopped. The city below still hummed with distant traffic, but inside the apartment, everything felt still. Imani sat alone at the kitchen table. The overhead light cast a soft glow across the room, while the rest of the apartment remained dark. William was asleep in the bedroom down the hall. She could hear the faint rhythm of his breathing through the partially closed door. Hours had passed since their conversation in the living room. Hours since the moment she told him she was pregnant. Twins. The words still echoed in her thoughts. Imani rested both hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. She had not taken a sip in nearly an hour. Her mind kept returning to William's reaction. He had hugged her. He had said the right things, but something important had been missing. Joy, excitement, the kind of energy that should have filled the room when two people learn they are about to become parents. Instead, William looked overwhelmed, distracted, already thinking about how the news would fit into his growing schedule of flights, meetings, and expansion plans. Imani slowly placed one hand on her stomach. It was still early in the pregnancy. Nothing about her body had changed yet in a visible way, but she knew they were there. Two small lives beginning their journey. Two children who would one day depend on her strength. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the apartment felt different, not because anything around her had changed, but because something inside her had finally become clear. For months, she had sensed the distance growing between her and William, the late nights, the missed conversations, the way his attention seemed to belong more to the outside world than to the life they once built together. She had tried to be patient, tried to remind herself that ambition often required sacrifice, but tonight the truth settled quietly into her thoughts. William wasn't doing it intentionally. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He had simply moved into a different rhythm of life, a rhythm where admiration, success, and opportunity filled most of his attention. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped being part of that rhythm. Imani looked around the apartment slowly. Every corner of the room held memories. The dining table where they shared late dinners during the early years of their marriage. The couch where they spent quiet evenings talking about dreams and future plans. The balcony where William once stood, holding a ring, and promised they would build their life together as equals. Those memories were real, but memories alone could not protect the future she was now responsible for. Imani lowered her gaze to her stomach again. "Okay," she whispered softly. Her voice carried a calm determination. The decision didn't arrive with anger. It didn't arrive with dramatic emotion. It simply appeared with quiet clarity. She could stay and hope William eventually noticed how far they had drifted apart. Or she could step forward and create a life where her children would grow up surrounded by certainty. Imani stood slowly from the table. The apartment floor felt cool beneath her feet as she walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. William was asleep, exactly where she left him. One arm rested across the pillow, while the city lights outside the window reflected faintly across his face. For a moment, Imani stood in the doorway watching him. This was the man she had once believed would be her partner for the rest of her life. And in many ways, he was still the same man she fell in love with. Ambitious, brilliant, driven. But the path he had chosen was now moving faster than the life they once promised each other. She stepped quietly into the room. Careful not to wake him, she walked to the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. Not the large travel bags they used for vacations, just a simple one. She placed it on the bed and began packing slowly. A few clothes, important documents, her notebook, the same notebook she had been filling with logistics ideas for years. She paused for a moment while holding it. Inside those pages were thoughts she had once shared freely with William. Ideas about transportation networks, cargo systems, ways to move goods more efficiently across cities. William had always admired her thinking, but lately, their conversations about those ideas had disappeared. She placed the notebook carefully inside the suitcase. When everything was packed, she closed the zipper quietly. The sound felt louder than expected in the still room. William shifted slightly in his sleep, but didn't wake. Imani picked up the suitcase and walked back toward the kitchen. She left the apartment key on the table. No letter, no dramatic explanation. William would understand eventually. Some decisions don't need long explanations. She slipped on her coat and stepped into the hallway outside their apartment. The building elevator carried her slowly down to the lobby. By the time she reached the street, the first hint of sunrise was beginning to lighten the sky above the city. Early morning delivery trucks moved along the avenues, while a few pedestrians hurried towards subway entrances. New York was waking up. Imani stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The cool morning air brushed against her face. Behind her stood the building where she had spent the last chapter of her life. Ahead of her waited an uncertain future. She placed one hand gently on her stomach again. "You're going to be okay," she whispered softly. Then she picked up her suitcase and began walking down the street as the sun slowly rose above the skyline. Some decisions don't make noise. They simply change the direction of a life forever. And on that quiet New York morning, Imani took the first step toward the future that would one day bring her back to this same city. Stepping off a private jet with Jordan and Maya beside her. When Imani stepped off the subway in Brooklyn that morning, the sun had already climbed above the buildings. The neighborhood looked almost exactly the way she remembered it. Corner stores were opening their doors. A delivery truck idled beside the sidewalk while someone unloaded crates of produce. Music drifted faintly from a nearby apartment window. Brooklyn had its own rhythm. It didn't rush the way Manhattan did. People greeted each other on the street. Neighbors paused to talk. Life moved forward with a sense of familiarity that made the city feel smaller and warmer. Imani stood for a moment on the sidewalk with her suitcase beside her. She had left behind a beautiful apartment, a marriage that once felt full of promise, and the man she believed would always stand beside her. Now she was back where her life began. And strangely, the return didn't feel like failure. It felt like breathing again. She began walking down the block. Several familiar storefronts still stood where they always had. The small grocery store on the corner, the laundromat with its faded sign, the cafe where neighbors gathered on weekends to talk about everything from sports to local news. Brooklyn had never cared about appearances the way other parts of the city sometimes did. People here valued something simpler, resilience. By the time she reached the apartment building where she grew up, the weight of exhaustion finally settled into her shoulders. Pregnancy already made her body feel heavier than usual, and the emotional journey of the past night lingered quietly in her thoughts. But when she stepped inside the building, something else greeted her. Familiar warmth. The hallway smelled faintly of someone cooking breakfast upstairs. A child's laughter echoed from an open door down the corridor. Life was happening here the same way it always had. Imani climbed the stairs slowly. Each step carried both uncertainty and determination. She knocked gently on the door. A moment later, it opened. The person standing there looked surprised at first. Then the surprise softened into understanding. No long questions followed. No complicated explanations were demanded. Sometimes the people who truly care about you recognize when silence is the kindest response. Imani stepped inside. That was the beginning of her new chapter. The months that followed were not easy. Pregnancy brought its own physical challenges, and carrying twins made every stage more demanding. Some mornings she woke up feeling strong and determined. Other mornings, fatigue pressed against her body before the day even started. But she never allowed fear to stay long. Whenever doubt appeared, she reminded herself of something her mother had told her many years earlier. Strength doesn't mean life is easy. It means you keep going anyway. Imani found small routines that helped her move forward. Morning walks through the neighborhood. Quiet afternoons reading and studying industry articles about shipping networks and transportation systems. Evenings filled with the comforting noise of family conversations and shared meals. The support around her never felt overwhelming. It appeared in small acts. A warm plate of food placed on the table without ceremony. Someone checking in with a simple question. "You doing okay today?" Those small gestures created a foundation of stability during a time when everything else in her life had changed. Meanwhile, the children growing inside her reminded her daily why she had made the decision to leave. Every doctor's appointment brought new images on the screen. 2 tiny heartbeats, 2 separate movements. 2 lives slowly forming. One afternoon after an appointment, Imani sat on a bench outside the clinic holding the printed ultrasound images. She studied them quietly. Jordan and Maya. At that moment, the names had not yet been spoken aloud. But somehow she already felt the presence of two distinct personalities waiting to arrive. The realization brought both excitement and responsibility. Raising one child required strength. Raising two would require even more. Still, the thought never frightened her. It motivated her. Months passed. The seasons shifted. Summer sunlight warmed the streets of Brooklyn, while Imani's pregnancy moved into its final stage. By the time autumn arrived again, the day finally came. The hospital room felt calm, despite the energy of the moment. Doctors and nurses moved with careful focus, while Imani breathed through the final moments of labor. Then, just like that, two small cries filled the room. The first baby arrived. Tiny fingers, bright eyes, blinking under the hospital lights. A few minutes later, the second child followed. The nurse placed them carefully beside Imani. For a moment she simply stared at them. Exhaustion and joy mixed together in a way words could barely describe. Two perfect little faces looked back at her. Two futures waiting to unfold. She whispered their names softly. Jordan. The first child shifted gently in the blanket. And Maya. The second baby stretched a tiny hand toward her. Imani smiled through tears. "Welcome to the world," she whispered. In that quiet hospital room, holding both children close, she made a promise that would shape everything that followed. "I'm going to build you a future," she said softly. "Not just survival, not just stability. A future strong enough to give them opportunities far beyond what she once imagined for herself." At that moment, Imani didn't know exactly how that future would unfold. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never stop working until Jordan and Maya had the life they deserved. And slowly, during the quiet nights when both babies finally slept, an old notebook began opening again on her kitchen table. Inside those pages were ideas she once discussed with William. Ideas about logistics, cargo networks, transportation systems connecting cities across the country. Ideas that had never truly left her mind, because the same curiosity that once impressed William still lived inside her. And soon, those ideas would become the foundation for the life that eventually brought her back to the airport, where their paths would cross again. The first year of raising Jordan and Maya passed in a blur of sleepless nights and quiet determination. Anyone who has cared for newborn twins understands how quickly time disappears. One child wakes just as the other finally falls asleep. Bottles, diapers, doctor visits, and short moments of rest fill every hour. Imani learned to move through those days with steady patience. Morning sunlight would often find her already awake, gently rocking one child, while the other rested nearby in a small crib. Jordan quickly revealed his personality. Even as a baby, he moved constantly. His tiny hands reached toward anything that caught his attention, and his bright eyes followed every sound around him. Maya was different. She studied the world quietly. When people spoke near her, she listened carefully, as if already trying to understand every word. Those small differences fascinated Imani. She often smiled watching them. Two children born on the same day, yet already becoming two very different individuals. Raising them required every bit of her focus, but it never erased the part of her mind that loved solving complex problems. Late at night, after both babies finally slept, Imani sometimes sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where she now prepared bottles and folded small clothes. Beside those everyday items rested a familiar object, her notebook. The pages inside still held ideas she had written years earlier: transportation diagrams, cargo schedules, notes about air routes and shipping delays. Those thoughts had once been part of long conversations she shared with William during the early years of their relationship. Now they belonged entirely to her. One evening, while Jordan and Maya slept quietly in the next room, Imani reopened the notebook again. She studied one page filled with diagrams connecting different cargo routes across several states. Something about the pattern bothered her. The industry treated cargo transportation like separate systems: airplanes, trucks, warehouses, each one operating independently. But Imani had always believed they should function as one coordinated structure. She began writing again. New notes filled the margins. Questions appeared beside older ideas. What if regional cargo flights connected directly with local trucking routes instead of operating on isolated schedules? What if smaller cargo airlines cooperated instead of competing against each other? What if deliveries could move across cities faster, simply by redesigning how those systems communicated. The ideas grew stronger the more she studied them. Eventually, an opportunity appeared unexpectedly. A small logistics company in Brooklyn struggled with delivery delays. Their warehouse operations constantly ran behind schedule, and customers were growing frustrated. Someone who knew Imani's interest in transportation systems mentioned her name to the company's manager. At first, the request was simple. Could she take a look at their shipping process and suggest improvements? Imani agreed. She visited the warehouse one afternoon while Jordan and Maya stayed with family for a few hours. The building itself was not impressive. Stacks of packages filled the loading area, while delivery trucks waited outside. But as Imani observed the workflow, the problem became obvious. The trucks left the warehouse based on outdated schedules instead of real-time cargo arrival. That single flaw caused constant delays. She explained her observations calmly. If the trucks leave 30 minutes after the cargo flights land instead of 2 hours later, you'll move everything faster, she said. The manager frowned thoughtfully. That simple? Sometimes the best solutions are. They tested her suggestion the following week. The results surprised everyone. Delivery times improved immediately. Customers noticed. Within a few months, other small logistics companies began hearing about the improvements she helped create. One company asked if she could review their warehouse timing. Another wanted help coordinating cargo deliveries between cities. Imani never advertised her services. Word simply traveled through conversations inside the industry. Her reputation began growing quietly. She approached every problem the same way. Study the system, find the delay, fix the connection. One evening, she attended a small logistics meeting where several companies discussed transportation challenges. Imani spoke briefly about improving coordination between cargo flights and trucking routes. After the meeting ended, a man approached her. "You understand these systems better than most people in this room," he said. Imani smiled politely. "I just pay attention to how things move." He studied her carefully. "Have you ever considered building something larger than consulting?" She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he asked a different question. "If you understand the system this well, why don't you build your own?" The words lingered in the air between them. For a moment, Imani didn't respond. The idea was bold, perhaps even risky, but something about the question stirred the same curiosity that once led her to fill notebooks with ideas about transportation networks. Later that night, after returning home, she sat once again at the kitchen table while Jordan and Maya slept peacefully nearby. The notebook opened in front of her. For the first time since leaving William, she allowed herself to imagine something bigger than consulting work. A network, a system connecting cargo routes across multiple regions, a structure built on efficiency instead of outdated habits. She stared at the pages quietly. Then she picked up her pen, because sometimes a single question is enough to open the door to an entirely different future. And the future Imani was about to begin building would eventually lead her back to New York City, stepping off a private jet with Jordan and Maya beside her, while the man who once believed she left with nothing stood frozen in an airport terminal, realizing how much he misunderstood the woman he thought he knew. The question stayed with Imani long after the meeting ended. If you understand the system this well, why don't you build your own? That night, after Jordan and Maya fell asleep, she sat at the kitchen table again with her notebook open in front of her. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. She looked at the pages filled with diagrams and notes. For years, she had studied transportation systems the way some people studied puzzles. Air routes, truck schedules, cargo timing, each part connected to another piece somewhere else. Most companies in the industry treated those systems like separate operations. But Imani had always believed they should function like one coordinated structure. She picked up her pen. New ideas began filling the pages. If smaller cargo airlines worked together instead of competing blindly, they could share routes more efficiently. If regional delivery trucks aligned their schedules with incoming cargo flights, packages would move across cities faster. If warehouse timing improved, entire shipping chains could operate without unnecessary delays. The ideas were practical, not flashy, but practical systems often create the strongest businesses. The next step required something she had not yet considered seriously: investment. Her consulting work had already caught the attention of several people inside the logistics industry. Some of them believed in her ideas, One of those conversations led to a small meeting a few weeks later. Imani explained her vision clearly. A coordinated cargo network built from regional airlines and delivery routes. Instead of trying to compete directly with the largest corporations, the system would focus on efficiency, better connections, faster movement, lower delays. The response surprised her. Several investors believed the idea could work, not because it promised instant headlines, but because the strategy solved problems that already existed. The first opportunity appeared sooner than expected. A small regional cargo airline had been struggling financially. The aircraft were still reliable. The flight crews were experienced, but the company lacked the operational strategy needed to compete with larger carriers. Imani studied the airline's routes carefully. They connected several important cargo hubs across the eastern United States. The potential was obvious. If those routes were reorganized and connected with reliable trucking networks, delivery times could improve dramatically. The investors agreed to purchase the airline. Imani helped restructure the entire operation. Flight schedules changed. Cargo loading procedures improved. Truck deliveries synchronized with aircraft arrival times. Within months, the difference became clear. Packages moved faster. Delays decreased. The airline began turning a profit again. That success opened the door for the next opportunity. Another regional cargo airline faced similar struggles. This one operated in several southern states. Again, the aircraft and crews were capable. The problem was poor coordination. Imani repeated the same strategy. Study the routes. Identify the delays. Redesign the connections. The results mirrored the first acquisition. Delivery times improved. Operating costs dropped. Investors noticed something important. Imani wasn't just fixing companies. She was connecting them. Each airline became part of a growing network. Cargo flights in one region linked with trucking routes in another. Warehouse schedules aligned with aircraft arrivals. What once operated as isolated businesses slowly transformed into a coordinated system. The network expanded gradually, not through flashy announcements, not through aggressive publicity, just through consistent improvement. Year by year, the system grew stronger. Meanwhile, the logistics industry continued evolving around them. Online shopping increased demand for faster deliveries. Businesses needed transportation systems that could move products quickly between cities. The network Imani was building quietly solved those problems. Packages moved across regions faster than many larger competitors expected. Investors trusted her judgment more with each success. More aircraft joined the network. More routes connected across different states. Still, Imani maintained the same working style she had always preferred. Careful observation, precise planning, efficient execution. She never chased attention. She focused on results. Several years passed this way. The cargo network expanded quietly, while most of the industry remained focused on larger corporations competing for headlines. What they didn't notice was how efficiently the smaller system was becoming. By connecting regional airlines and trucking routes together, Imani had built something unique. A flexible network capable of moving goods across multiple regions without the slow decision-making structures that often slowed larger companies. During one late evening review meeting, one of the investors studied the numbers carefully. "These delivery times are better than several major carriers," he said. Imani nodded calmly. "That's because the system is designed around coordination instead of competition." The investor leaned back in his chair. "You're building something bigger than a group of airlines." Imani looked at the route diagrams displayed across the screen. "Yes," she said quietly. She was building a system, one that would eventually stretch across multiple regions, one that would quietly influence how goods moved between cities. And without realizing it yet, that growing system was slowly approaching a point where it would intersect directly with another logistics network, the one William had spent years building. While William's company focused on large contracts and industry attention, Imani's network was strengthening the infrastructure those systems relied on. Neither of them knew it yet, but the paths they once shared were gradually moving toward another collision. While the cargo network continued expanding across different regions, Imani's daily life followed a very different rhythm. Every morning began the same way. Jordan usually woke first. His energy arrived before the sun most days. By the time the first light crept through the apartment windows, he was already sitting up in bed, asking questions about everything around him. "Mommy, is today a school day?" "Yes," Imani would answer gently, while tying his shoelaces. Are airplanes flying already? They've been flying all night. Jordan always smiled when he heard that. The idea that planes moved through the sky while most people slept fascinated him. Maya woke more slowly. She preferred quiet mornings. Instead of rushing around like her brother, she often sat near the window, eating breakfast while watching the street below. Where are all those trucks going? She once asked. Delivering things people ordered, Imani replied. From airplanes? Sometimes. Maya nodded thoughtfully, as if trying to connect the pieces. Raising the twins filled Imani's life with a constant stream of small moments. School drop-offs, homework at the kitchen table, bedtime stories. Most people who saw her during those daily routines had no idea she was quietly building a transportation network across multiple states. Imani preferred it that way. She never wanted Jordan and Maya to feel like their mother's work was more important than the time she spent with them. Whenever her schedule allowed, she included them in small adventures around the city. One of their favorite outings involved visiting a public viewing area near the airport. The location wasn't crowded with tourists. Mostly families gathered there to watch planes arrive and depart. Jordan loved those visits. The moment they stepped out of the car, he would look toward the runway with excitement. Look! He shouted once as a cargo plane lifted into the sky. Imani followed his gaze. That one's carrying packages, she said. Where are they going? Different cities. Jordan clapped his hands. I want to ride on one someday. You will, she told him. Maya approached the experience differently. Instead of reacting immediately, she watched carefully. She studied how the aircraft lined up before takeoff, how the engines grew louder as the plane accelerated down the runway. One afternoon, she asked a question that made Imani smile. Why do the planes wait in line before flying? Because they have to take turns, Imani explained. Like when kids line up at school. Exactly like that. Maya seemed satisfied with the answer. Moments like those reminded Imani why she worked so hard. Jordan and Maya knew nothing about the difficult chapter of her life before they were born. They didn't know about the apartment she left behind. They didn't know about William. To them, their mother was simply the person who packed their lunches, helped with homework, and explained how the world worked. And Imani intended to keep it that way. The past did not belong to them. Their future did. Balancing motherhood with business responsibilities required careful organization. Some days involved long conference calls about route expansions and airline operations. Other days required travel to inspect facilities connected to the network. Whenever those trips became necessary, Imani made sure Jordan and Maya remained surrounded by the same stable environment they always knew. But even during busy weeks, she maintained one rule: dinner together whenever possible. No matter how demanding the business became, those evenings remained reserved for the three of them. Jordan often used that time to share his newest fascination. Did you know airplanes can fly across the ocean? He said one night while waving a book about aircraft. Yes, Imani replied. How long does it take? Sometimes several hours. Jordan looked amazed. That's far. Maya quietly flipped through the pages beside him. She pointed to a diagram showing the inside of a plane. How do the pilots know where to go? They use instruments and navigation systems, Imani explained. Maya studied the picture carefully, so they don't get lost. That's right. As the twins grew older, those conversations became more thoughtful. Jordan continued loving anything that moved. Cars, trains, airplanes. Maya became fascinated by understanding how things worked, why systems followed certain patterns, why schedules mattered. Sometimes their questions reminded Imani of her own curiosity years earlier when she first started studying transportation networks. Watching them grow filled her with quiet pride. They were developing their own personalities, their own interests, their own futures, and all of it existed far away from the life she left behind. Meanwhile, the cargo network she helped build continued expanding in the background. New routes connected different regions. More companies relied on the system to move goods efficiently between cities. The success never changed the way she raised her children. Jordan and Maya never heard conversations about investor meetings or airline acquisitions. Instead, they heard bedtime stories, laughter in the kitchen, and their mother's steady voice explaining how the world worked. They didn't know their mother was shaping an entire transportation network. They only knew she was the person who held their hands while watching planes lift into the sky. And somehow that balance between family and ambition became the quiet foundation supporting everything she was building. Because while the world outside focused on business success and industry competition, Imani was raising two children who believed their mother simply loved watching airplanes with them. By the time Jordan and Maya reached their 5th birthday, the cargo network Imani helped build had grown into something far larger than anyone expected during those early planning meetings. What began as a strategy to connect struggling regional airlines had gradually turned into a transportation system spanning multiple parts of the country. Aircraft from different companies now operated on coordinated schedules. Cargo transfers between flights and delivery trucks happened with far fewer delays. Warehouses aligned their operations with arrival times instead of forcing shipments to wait hours before moving again. The system worked because it solved a simple problem: time. Every improvement reduced wasted time between one step of transportation and the next. And when time improves, everything else follows. Packages arrive faster. Costs decrease. Customers notice the difference. Inside the logistics industry, quiet conversations about the network began appearing more often. Companies that once struggled with delivery reliability now depended on the coordinated routes Imani helped design. Still, most of the public had never heard her name. She never pursued publicity. The system spoke through its performance. Then a new opportunity appeared, one that would change the balance of power across the industry. A regional cargo airline located along several major transportation corridors had fallen into financial trouble. The company operated aircraft connecting important cargo hubs across multiple states. For years, those routes carried enormous volumes of shipments between distribution centers. But poor management and outdated scheduling systems had pushed the airline toward collapse. Investors inside Imani's network began studying the situation carefully. If the company shut down, several important cargo corridors would disappear overnight. But if the routes were reorganized properly, they could strengthen the entire network. Imani reviewed the airline's route maps late one evening while Jordan and Maya slept in their rooms. Lines stretched across the screen connecting airports in different regions. She traced one route with her finger, then another. The pattern became clear quickly. This airline held connections linking several cargo hubs already operating inside the network she had been building. If those routes joined the system, the entire structure would become far more powerful. The decision required careful discussion. Acquiring the airline would require a significant financial commitment, but the long-term advantages were impossible to ignore. Several meetings followed. Financial projections were studied. Operational plans were reviewed. Finally, the investors reached an agreement. They would purchase the struggling airline and integrate its routes into the growing cargo network. The acquisition moved forward quietly. No dramatic announcements, no media attention, just a series of business decisions finalized behind closed doors. Once the agreement became official, the real work began. Imani immediately began analyzing the airline's existing schedule. Aircraft departure times changed. Cargo transfers reorganized. Truck routes adjusted to match the new flight arrivals. Within months, the improvements became visible. Shipments moved through the network with greater efficiency than ever before. The acquisition strengthened the entire structure. But during one routine review meeting, something unexpected appeared in the data. A list of companies heavily dependent on the newly acquired cargo routes. One name immediately stood out: Williams Logistics Company. Imani stared at the screen for a moment. The realization arrived quietly, but clearly. Over the past several years, Williams Company had built a large transportation operation connecting warehouses and delivery systems across multiple states. Much of that system relied on cargo flights moving through the very routes her network now controlled. Those routes formed the backbone of his shipping schedule. Without them, his delivery network would struggle to function properly. Imani leaned back in her chair. The room around her remained silent while the information settled into place. She had spent years building a transportation system piece by piece. Now that system controlled critical infrastructure supporting Williams' business. The discovery didn't bring anger. It didn't bring satisfaction either, just quiet understanding. Life had moved them onto separate paths after she left their apartment years earlier. William chased expansion through contracts and investors. Imani built infrastructure connecting the movement of goods across regions. And somewhere along those two journeys, their professional worlds had crossed again without either of them noticing. Until now, the cargo airline network she helped create had become an essential component of the logistics systems William depended on. He had no reason to suspect anything unusual. From his perspective, the airline routes continued operating as they always had, but behind those operations stood a network now controlled by the company Imani helped build. Later that evening, she returned home where Jordan and Maya were finishing homework at the kitchen table. Jordan looked up when she entered the room. "Mommy, did you know some airplanes carry animals?" he asked excitedly. "Sometimes they do," she said with a smile. Maya closed her notebook and looked at her. "Did you see airplanes today?" "Yes," Imani replied. "Lots of them." The twins returned to their homework without realizing how significant the day's business decisions had been, and Imani preferred it that way. To Jordan and Maya, their mother was simply the person helping them solve math problems at the kitchen table. They had no idea that the transportation network shaping their future had just taken control of the cargo routes supporting one of the largest logistics companies in the country. The same company founded by the man who once believed Imani had left his life with nothing, and very soon, that unseen connection would lead her back to the airport, where William stood holding someone else's bags, because the cargo network now required a meeting with airline partners in New York. At John F. Kennedy Airport, the very place where their lives had separated 5 years earlier, and where their paths were about to cross again. Inside the terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport, everything around William continued moving normally. Passengers hurried toward their gates. Rolling suitcases crossed the polished floor. Flight announcements echoed through the speakers above the crowd. But William hadn't taken a single step since the moment he saw the private jet outside the window. Through the glass, he watched as Imani walked across the runway with Jordan and Maya holding her hands. 5 years. 5 entire years had passed since the last time he saw her. Yet the recognition had been immediate. She looked different now, not just in appearance. There was something in the way she carried herself that made the distance between them feel even larger than the runway outside. Jordan pointed excitedly at another aircraft, preparing for departure. "Look," he shouted, "that one's taking off." The engines roared as the plane lifted into the sky. Maya watched quietly, studying the moment the same way she studied everything. Imani smiled down at them. William's chest tightened. He couldn't hear their voices through the glass, but he could see their expressions clearly. The boy's excitement, the girl's curiosity. 2 children, who looked about 5 years old. His mind moved slowly through the realization. 5 years, the same amount of time since Imani walked out of his life. Behind him, the influencer shifted impatiently. "William," she said, lowering her phone from her live stream, "are we going or not?" He didn't answer. His attention remained fixed on the runway. Airport staff approached Imani and guided her toward the very important person entrance. Within minutes, the glass doors opened. Imani stepped inside the terminal with Jordan and Maya beside her. The temperature-controlled air rushed gently around them as they entered the building. For a brief moment, the noise of the airport surrounded them just like everyone else. Jordan's eyes widened immediately. "Mommy, look how big this place is." Maya turned slowly, watching travelers pass by. "So many people," she said quietly. Imani held their hands as they walked forward. Then she looked up and saw William. The distance between them inside the terminal was not far, just a few steps across the open floor. Yet those steps carried the weight of 5 years of silence. William felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The influencer noticed the shift in his posture. She followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "Who is that?" she asked. William's voice came out softer than he expected. "That's..." He paused. "My wife." The influencer raised an eyebrow. "Your ex-wife, you mean?" William didn't correct her, because suddenly, that word felt heavier than it ever had before. Imani walked forward calmly. Jordan and Maya stayed close beside her. When they reached William, she stopped. For a brief moment, the noise of the airport seemed to fade around them. "Hello, William," she said. Her voice sounded exactly the way he remembered. Warm, steady. William struggled to find the right words. "Imani." The name left his mouth quietly. Jordan looked up at the 2 adults curiously. "Mommy, do you know him?" Imani knelt gently beside the twins. "Yes," she said softly. "I knew him a long time ago." The children studied William with open curiosity. Jordan waved politely. "Hi." William felt his throat tighten. "Hi," he replied. Up close, he could see them clearly now. Jordan's bright eyes reflected the same energy he saw earlier on the runway. Maya's thoughtful expression reminded him of someone else entirely, a quiet observation that made his chest ache unexpectedly. He swallowed slowly. "They're yours?" he asked. Imani stood again. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer carried more meaning than the single word suggested. 5 years, 2 children, an entire chapter of life that existed without him. William felt the realization settle heavily in his thoughts. Behind him, the influencer watched carefully. At first she looked mildly annoyed by the interruption, but curiosity soon replaced that irritation. The moment unfolding in front of her clearly held more history than she expected. Jordan tugged gently on Imani's hand. "Mommy, are we going to see more airplanes?" "Soon," she said. Maya looked up at William again. "You look surprised." William gave a quiet laugh. "I guess I am." The honesty in the response surprised even him, because standing here in the middle of a crowded airport, William suddenly understood something he hadn't fully considered before. While he spent the past 5 years building his business and chasing expansion, life had continued moving forward for Imani in ways he never imagined. 2 children had grown from infancy to 5 years old. 5 birthdays. 5 years of first steps, first words, first days of school. Moments he had never witnessed. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest. He looked at Imani again. "You look well," he said quietly. Imani nodded. "Life has been busy." The calmness in her voice carried no anger, no bitterness, just simple truth. For a moment, William didn't know what to say next, and that silence lasted just long enough for something else to happen. Because across the terminal floor, someone wearing a dark business suit was already walking toward them. And within the next few minutes, William would discover something about Imani's life that would completely shift the balance of power he believed still existed between them. The brief silence between William and Imani lasted only a few seconds, but for William, those seconds felt longer. He was still trying to understand what he was seeing. Imani standing in front of him after 5 years. Jordan and Maya beside her, 2 children whose lives had unfolded completely outside his awareness. Before he could gather his thoughts, a man in a dark business suit approached from across the terminal. His walk was purposeful, professional. When he reached them, his attention moved directly to Imani. "Good morning," he said respectfully. "Your meeting with the airline partners is ready whenever you are." William frowned slightly. "Airline partners?" Imani nodded calmly. "Thank you." The man glanced briefly toward Jordan and Maya with a polite smile before stepping back to give them space. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but something about the exchange caught William's attention immediately. The tone of the man's voice, the respect, the assumption that Imani was the person leading the meeting. William looked at her again. "You have a meeting here?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "with the airline network partners." William's confusion deepened. "The cargo airline network?" "That's right." Behind him, the influencer lowered her phone slightly. Her live stream had ended several minutes earlier when she realized the conversation happening in front of her was more interesting than the travel content she planned to record. Now she watched closely. William studied Imani's expression. "You work with them now?" Imani met his gaze calmly. "My company manages the network." For a moment, William didn't fully process the sentence. The words seemed simple, but the meaning behind them arrived slowly. "My company manages the network." He blinked. "What company?" "The cargo airline network that recently acquired several regional carriers," she explained. William felt something shift in his thoughts. He knew exactly which network she was referring to. His logistics company relied on those airline routes for a significant portion of its shipping operations. "Wait," he said quietly. "You're telling me?" Imani finished the thought for him. "Yes, our company now oversees those routes." The realization moved through William's mind, piece by piece. His business had grown rapidly during the past several years, but much of that growth depended on reliable cargo flights connecting distribution centers across multiple regions. Those flights traveled along the very routes Imani was now describing. William stared at her. "You built that network?" Imani answered simply. "It grew over time." The influencer's expression changed immediately. A moment earlier, she stood beside William with the comfortable confidence of someone traveling with a powerful businessman. Now, her attention shifted toward Imani, not out of admiration, out of calculation. Influence always attracts attention. And suddenly, the center of influence in the room had changed. William exhaled slowly. That explains the private jet. It belongs to the company, Imani replied. Jordan tugged gently on her sleeve. Mommy, what's a network? She smiled down at him. It's when a lot of different things connect and work together. Jordan seemed satisfied with that answer. Maya, however, studied William again. You look confused, she said thoughtfully. William managed a faint smile. That's because I am... The honesty surprised everyone, even himself. Behind him, the influencer shifted slightly. Her attention had clearly moved away from William now. Moments earlier, she had been explaining their luxury travel plans to thousands of followers. Now she looked at Imani with a different kind of interest. The kind that appears when someone realizes they may have misjudged the hierarchy in a room. William noticed the shift. It didn't bother him as much as he expected. His attention remained fixed on Imani. You built a cargo airline network, he said slowly. Yes, and my company depends on those routes. That's correct. William let out a quiet breath. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not competition, perspective. 5 years earlier, he believed Imani had walked away from their life with nothing. Now she stood in front of him as the person overseeing infrastructure his entire business relied on, not through revenge, not through confrontation, simply through years of work he never witnessed. The man in the dark suit approached again. Imani, he said gently. The partners are waiting in the conference area. She nodded. We'll be there in a moment. Jordan and Maya held her hands patiently while the adults spoke. William looked down at them again. 5 years of childhood had passed. 5 years of questions he had never answered. 5 years of moments he had never shared. And the quiet reality settling into his mind felt heavier than any business revelation, because success and influence could change quickly in the business world, but lost time never returned. The influencer glanced at William once more, then back at Imani, and without saying anything, she stepped slightly away. For the first time since he met her, William noticed something about that movement. The attention she once directed toward him had shifted, because the power dynamic in the room had quietly reversed, and the person holding that power wasn't the man she arrived at the airport with. It was the woman he once believed had nothing left after walking away. For a moment after the airline representative stepped away, the four of them remained standing together in the middle of the terminal. Passengers continued moving past them. Suitcases rolled across the floor. Flight announcements echoed through the speakers. But William barely noticed any of it. His attention stayed on Jordan and Maya, 2 children who stood calmly beside Imani as if this airport moment were nothing unusual. To them, it was simply another stop on a trip. To William, it felt like standing in front of 5 years he had never lived. He looked at Imani again. I didn't know, he said quietly. The words carried more weight than their simplicity suggested. Imani understood what he meant immediately. You weren't supposed to, she replied calmly. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just honesty. William nodded slowly. I should have been there. The sentence came out softer than he intended. Jordan looked up at him curiously. Where? William hesitated. Imani answered gently before the silence stretched too long. He means, when you were little. Jordan accepted that explanation easily. Children rarely question things that adults complicate. But Maya continued studying William with the same thoughtful attention she had shown since the moment they met him. William shifted slightly. I'm sorry, Imani. The apology surprised even him. Years earlier, he might have defended himself, explained the pressure of business, blamed circumstances, but standing in front of her now, none of those explanations felt meaningful. I should have listened more, he continued. I should have paid attention to what was happening between us. Imani didn't interrupt. She simply watched him for a moment. Life moved forward, she said finally. That's what life does. William understood the meaning behind those words. Some mistakes cannot be corrected. They simply become part of the story people carry with them. Jordan suddenly pointed toward the window again. Mommy, look, another plane. Outside the glass, A large aircraft slowly rolled across the runway. Jordan bounced slightly on his feet with excitement. "I want to see it take off." Imani smiled. "We'll watch it in a minute." Maya, however, remained focused on William. Her expression had not changed since their conversation began. She tilted her head slightly. Then she asked a question that stopped the moment completely. "Mommy," she said. "Yes? Why does that man look like us?" The words floated through the air with the natural curiosity only a child could express. William felt the world pause around him. Jordan looked at Maya, then back at William. Now that the idea had been spoken aloud, he studied William more closely. Imani remained still for a moment, not shocked, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. She knelt beside the twins. Her voice remained gentle. "Sometimes people share similarities," she said carefully. Maya considered that answer. Jordan continued studying William's face with new interest. "You do look a little like us," he said. William felt his throat tighten again. 5 years. 5 years of birthdays. First words. First questions. All the moments that shape a child's understanding of the world. Moments he had never witnessed. Imani stood again. Her eyes met William's one more time. The silence between them held everything neither of them needed to explain. The past, the distance, the life she had built after walking away. Finally she spoke. "We should go," she said softly. "The meeting is waiting." Jordan grabbed her hand immediately. "Are we going to see more airplanes after?" "Yes," she replied. Maya followed beside them. Before turning away, she looked back at William once more. "Bye." William managed a quiet smile. "Goodbye." Imani paused for a brief moment before walking toward the conference area. "Take care of yourself, William," she said. Then she continued forward with Jordan and Maya beside her. William remained standing in the terminal, watching them disappear into the corridor beyond the very important person entrance. The influencer stood several steps away, unusually silent. For once, she had nothing to say, because the moment unfolding in front of them had revealed something more powerful than money or reputation. Sometimes the people we believe we understand the most are the ones we underestimate completely. William had once believed Imani walked away from their life with nothing, but the truth standing in front of him now was far more complicated. She had walked away with her dignity, her intelligence, and the determination to build something stronger than the life she left behind. And somewhere during those 5 years, while William chased expansion and attention, Imani had built a future powerful enough to change the entire balance between them. As I look back at stories like this, one lesson always stands out clearly. Never measure someone's future by the moment you last saw them. Life has a way of transforming people in ways we never expect. Some people leave quietly, not to escape, but to grow. And sometimes the greatest success isn't proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's simply building a life so strong that the past no longer has the power to define it. 5 years earlier, Imani walked out of William's life carrying one suitcase. 5 years later, she returned to the same city stepping off a private jet, with Jordan and Maya holding her hands, not because she needed anyone to notice, but because the future she built was waiting for her there. And this time, she arrived on her own terms. Before we close this story, take a moment and think about the lesson hidden inside it. Sometimes in life, the people we underestimate are the same people who go away quietly, build something powerful, and return stronger than anyone imagined. Imani didn't leave to prove a point. She left to protect her peace, raise her children, and build a future that no one could take from her. And years later, that quiet decision changed everything. So let me ask you something. If you were in William's position, standing in that airport, realizing you missed 5 years of your children's lives, what would you do next? Would you try to rebuild the relationship? Or would you accept that some chances in life only come once? Share your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear what you think. And if this story touched you in any way, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next powerful story. Also, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. It's always amazing to see how these stories travel around the world. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that walking away from the wrong situation can sometimes lead to the greatest future, share this story with them, because sometimes the strongest move a person can make is simply choosing a better path.